Gospel according to John.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not be enough to buy bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea, coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
I would like to invite the children to come forward now. Anyone? Good morning. So I have a question for you this morning. Are you ever afraid? I tell you what, I'm sometimes afraid. You know, one thing I don't like very much is snakes. And when I walk around in the woods and I turn a corner and there's a snake on the trail, I'm afraid. Here's another thing that I'm afraid of. When I'm laying in bed at night and I hear a loud noise and I don't know what it is, sometimes I get a little afraid of that. And I bet that if you thought long and hard, you would discover things that you're afraid of too. Yep. I think we're all afraid of something now and then. In the story that you just heard, Jesus' disciples were in a boat on a big lake, and a storm came up. And the disciples, Jesus' friends, were afraid because they thought the boat might sink. But then Jesus came to them, walking on the water, and he said, "My friends, it's me. Don't be afraid." And so when we're afraid, we can hear that voice of Jesus saying to us, "It's me. I'm here. Don't be afraid." Because Jesus is always with us. So don't be afraid. You can go back to your seats. How much is enough? I heard someone say once that enough is just a little more than what I have. Which is apparently why people who have a perfectly comfortable lifestyle continue to buy lottery tickets, dreaming about what they would do with a whole lot more than what they have. Ask a guitar player how many guitars are enough, and they will probably answer one more than what I have. How big a boat is enough? Just a little bigger than the one you have. Enough is a tricky thing to think about in a culture that is more about scarcity than enough. Conversations in Washington always give us the impression that we have to cut something because there isn't enough money for some this or some that. And over the years, I've talked to a lot of people who live their life, who have comfortable retirement savings, but who yet live their lives in the constant fear that their money will run out before the end of their lives. And of course, I have also known people whose need was real and who legitimately did not have enough. We are conditioned to think of enough as a zero-sum game that is more about the scarcity of resources than the abundance of resources. And if we want to do A, then we will not be able to do B or C, or if we want to do B, then A will have to be cut and C can't be done at all, because as we know, it is a zero-sum game. That narrative of scarcity is challenged by what we hear in this morning's readings. In the first reading, the prophet Elisha encounters a hungry crowd in the midst of a famine. And someone has a few loaves of barley bread. Barley bread is the bread that the poor people would eat. And clearly the 20 loaves of bread were not going to be enough for everyone. Yet Elisha tells the man to distribute the bread anyway. And miraculously, there's enough to go around. Elisha trusts God, and God provides enough and even more to satisfy the need. In the gospel lesson, throngs of people are following Jesus. He's been healing their sick and teaching them. People have discovered that this itinerant rabbi has much to offer. Jesus tries to get away from them and goes up the side of a mountain. And he sits down there with his disciples for a little R&R. But there is not much rest and there is not much recreation because the crowds follow him. And Jesus takes responsibility to make sure the crowds have something to eat. And with a twinkle in his eye, Jesus asks Philip a test question. Hey, Phil, help me out here. The crowds are hungry. Where can we get them some lunch? And the first thing Philip does is the calculations. Looks out at the crowd and sees thousands, a lot of people. And then he responds that 6 months' paychecks would not be enough to even get this crowd a sandwich and a bag of chips. Andrew also recognizes the magnitude of the situation. Now, he doesn't so much do the calculations as look around to see what's available. And he sees that a poor boy has his traveling lunch. A few small loaves of, yeah, you guessed it, barley bread. And some dried fish. The equivalent of a granola bar and a piece of beef jerky in the car. What's available is almost a joke in the face of such need. Andrew asks,
What good is the boy's lunch in the face of so much need? I hardly think Andrew's question is a serious one. He's not asking it in the hope that it will do any good, but rather as an indication of the scarcity of the resources. And you know the rest of the story. In the hands of Jesus, scarcity becomes abundance. The poor boy's lunch becomes provision for thousands. Now, may I remind you that this is but one story in a large collection of biblical stories that remind us of how things work in God's kingdom. Even in the psalm that we read this morning, the eyes of all wait upon you, O Lord, and you give them their food in due season. You open your hand and satisfy the need of every living thing. Which brings us back to the very first story in the Bible. Creation was filled with abundant provision for people and for all the creatures. When God delivered the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, God provided manna every morning, bread for their journey, and everyone had enough. And when Isaiah proclaimed what the coming kingdom would be like, he wrote that the Lord would make a rich feast for all people, a feast of rich food and rich wines so abundant that the wine would be dripping from the sides of the mountains. These stories challenge us. They offer a different reality. One that is often hidden behind the narratives of scarcity and zero-sum accounting. And so, dear church, what shall we do with a story of a miraculous feeding? What should we do with a story in a day when church membership is declining and the cost of keeping the church doors open just keeps going up and up and up? What shall we do with this story, dear church? In a community, a nation, a world where we know that children go to bed hungry, where families don't have adequate housing, where too many are living on the edge. Well, I suppose one response would be simply to throw our hands up, shrug our shoulders, and say, well, that's just the way it is. And then go merrily on our way, certain that there is never enough to go around. But this story addresses precisely that temptation. When we say the need is overwhelming and the resources are too scarce, Jesus says, tell the people to sit down, because I'm about to act. Jesus acts. Jesus does something. Not just in a miracle, but in his entire ministry, his life, death, and resurrection. Jesus acts and addresses the hunger that is at the very heart of human life. The gospel writer John here wants to tell us something more important than miraculous provision for a crowd. His purpose is not to suggest that we believers will be provided miraculously by some wondrous king. Rather, the point is that Jesus is all we need for life. Life. Life with a capital L. Did you notice the little chronological clue that John gives us? There's this little sentence stuck in verse 4 that seems to have nothing to do with anything else in the story. It reads, now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Do you remember what the Passover celebrates? The Passover is the feast that celebrates the great deliverance. It was the yearly commemoration of the Exodus from Egypt, the beginning of the journey from slavery to freedom. God was making it possible for God's people to live a new life together with God in their midst. By setting the event near the Passover when the Messiah was expected to appear, John uses the story to proclaim that Jesus is the one. He is the one who has come to bring us from slavery to sin to freedom and life with God. And he has given his life in death so that we might have life. because of that, dear church, there is enough. There is enough for all. Our cries of never enough are never the last word. Scarcity is a mindset that refuses to acknowledge how God works. In God's economy, we are simply called to take what we have and offer it to God and to the world. And to offer not only what we have, but who we are, our very lives. In the hands of Jesus, what we have and who we are will be multiplied, and there will be more than enough for everyone. When we feel inadequate, we remind ourselves that it is not up to us to solve the world's problems. God has already given us what we need. Our task is to open our eyes, to see what we have been given, and then to open our hearts to share with a world that is in need. The answer to the narrative of scarcity is to remember God's abundant providence. Remember Andrew's question? What good is what we have for so much need? It's the wrong question. The question is, what have we already been given? What do we have? And then to offer to God, believing that God will bless it. Ministry is not just about stretching our meager resources. It is to offer God what we have so that in God's hands what we are becomes a revelation of God's amazing grace to the whole world. In 1946, a young woman named Agnes Gonja Boyaju came face to face with the masses of suffering and dying people in Calcutta. You ever heard of her? You probably know her better as Mother Teresa. She experienced a call to serve those who were suffering the most. She was a smart woman. She came from a wealthy family. But her wisdom, her knowledge, her wealth were meager in the face of such human need. Armed only with her call, she started an order that we know as the Missionaries of Charity, a small order of 13 members. And in the decades to come, that order would grow to thousands and thousands of people, giving care in scores of orphanages and charity centers in places of dire human need. Love multiplies meager resources and makes a way forward for God's kingdom. And now the church, the one who fed thousands, will feed us with his body and his blood. He offers himself yet again for our life. And there is enough for all.